I signed the Billionaire's contract that night. Manhattan glittered like a stage set beneath the penthouse glass, and the weight of her hand on my hip felt like both an anchor and an accusation. The paper lay between us on the lacquered desk, clean, expensive, and strange. Clause 7 was underlined in the same black ink that had signed her name. I read it twice before I put my initials where she asked. If you like twisty WLW stories, stay with me. I promise this one gets messy, and I don't mean just the spilled champagne. I'd been serving canapes the night everything started. The Sterling Gala was one of those charity things that pretended to be intimate while 100 people practiced their gratitude in diamonds. I came from a life that measured itself in overtime shifts and tips, in the steady hum of washing machines and my mother's sighs when rent was due. My father had been gone for years. The word upstairs meant somewhere I'd never been invited to live. That's the thing about service jobs. You get very good at making other people's lives look seamless. Catherine Sterling walked like someone whose whole life had been built to fill a room. There was an impeccable cut to her shoulders, a quiet in her eyes that made people speak for her. People called her the Ice Widow of Manhattan, said she'd inherited everything when her husband died, and then forgot to look for soft spots. They were wrong and right at the same time. The thing is, people like her are as frozen as they are tender. You just need to find the seam. It was a champagne accident. A bridesmaid, no, a donor's assistant, banged into my tray and sent 3 flutes arching toward Catherine. Time slowed in the way it always does when you're trying not to be the one to ruin someone else's night. Glass shivered. One of the flutes swung and landed against Catherine's sleeve. The champagne spilled across silk and skin like a comet. The room inhaled. I apologized before I even knew what I'd said. She didn't look angry. She looked amused, and that steadied me in a way no tip ever could. Her hand came down to take a napkin, and then, in the way of people who are used to being waited on, she lifted my wrist and checked to see if my bracelet had broken. Her fingers were cool. I must have blushed because she gave me a crooked smile and said, "It's all right. Accidents happen." She could have dismissed me. Instead, she asked my name. "Lily," I said. "Lily Torres." Her lips twitched. "Lily Torres," she repeated. "You've been at Sterling events before?" I found myself answering with the practiced frankness of someone who'd grown used to being where eyes flickered over the uniform instead of meeting the face. "For 3 years. I work catering. I know where the extra napkins are." She laughed softly, and something in the laugh felt like a permission. Before the night was over, she'd asked for my card. I told her I didn't have one. The night manager printed one with my name and a line for position in block letters that said server. She kept it anyway. A week later, there was an envelope in my mailbox, an official one, with Sterling Enterprises stamped at the top. My hands shook as I opened it, as if a confession lay folded inside. Inside was an invitation to a meeting. "Ms. Torres, Ms. Sterling would like to meet you regarding a temporary administrative position. Compensation commensurate with experience." I laughed in the kitchen while my mother stirred the soup. "They want me to type for them, Ma," I said. "Maybe I'll finally learn how to use a stapler that isn't jammed." My mother didn't laugh. She gave me the look she gave when she calculated household math in her head and decided to be hopeful without saying so aloud. "Go," she said. "You'll get out of those double shifts." So I went. I took the B train, feeling conspicuous in my cheap coat, and pressed the elevator button in a building where the chandelier was a light sculpture, and the security guard nodded at me like he already knew who I was. Catherine met me in a foyer that smelled faintly of jasmine and paper. Up close, she was not a myth. She was a woman with freckles at the bridge of her nose, and a voice like velvet rubbed with steel. Her smile was smaller when she was alone, softer. She told me the position was temporary, 6 weeks to cover an assistant's maternity leave, and then she slid a contract across the walnut desk. It was elegant and precise, and it had clause 7. She watched me read it the way someone watches a tide, with a face that learns how to be still. Clause 7 said, in language smooth as silk, that certain discretionary arrangements could be made between executive principal and personal assistant, with compensation adjusted to reflect any additional personal duties performed outside the normal scope of work. It could mean extra errands, late-night scheduling, and yes, very faintly implied, social accompaniment. I folded the corner of the page and looked at her. "You don't have to sign anything you don't want to," she said. The room hummed with the city beyond the glass. She left the decision completely to me. She asked me if I had questions. She told me she'd arranged for a salary that would cover tuition for my part-time classes and a housing stipend that would mean my mother could breathe for the first time in months. She offered me health insurance, which I had never had more than a rumor of. She offered, in short, the kind of stability that had always been an announcement on someone else's life. Never a promise. I thought about the nights I slept on a mattress that sighed louder than any ambulatory city noise, about the way my mother's laugh cracked when she hid worry in the sink. I thought about the tip jar's dented lip. I weighed the reality of my life against a sheet of paper and the hand that signed her last name in long, unapologetic strokes. "Clause 7, I repeated. "It feels a little open." "It's deliberately flexible," Catherine said. "We rely on loyalty and discretion at this level. I don't want to constrain an employee with contractual nonsense if life requires nuance, but I also want to ensure that any arrangements are consensual and compensated." Her emphasis on consent made me blink. I had expected predatory language. I had, in my head, rehearsed what a woman like her could demand. Instead, she talked about choice like it was a currency we both respected. That made the decision both harder and easier. "You understand that there's a power imbalance," I said. "I do," she replied, in a voice that had the faintest tremor when she admitted something that could be used against her. "And that is why everything must be transparent. If you accept, we will write the terms together. I will never ask you to do something you're uncomfortable with. You can leave at any time." I signed. I didn't sign because I thought I could be bought with insurance. I signed because there was an honesty in her phrasing that I hadn't expected, because the stipend meant my mother's leaky roof could finally be patched without another season of borrowed sleep, because for the first time a door opened that didn't ask me to apologize for existing. The first days were vertiginous in the best possible way. They smelled like toner and fresh coffee and Catherine's black designer soap. My new office was a room with a view, floor-to-ceiling glass that looked down on rows of cars like toy soldiers. I learned to set appointments and handle her calendar, to read the delicate code of corporate email when the stakes were to Mr. Reed and the board. People at the company treated me like a curiosity wrapped in a name badge. I had to earn their steady gaze. Catherine's world moved at a temperature I had to learn to breathe in. The team at Sterling had rhythms: early strategy, late philanthropy, midweek private briefings. Her assistant before me had been efficient and invisible. They liked efficiency because it made tragedy look smaller. They also liked perfection because it kept the rumor mill from grinding too loud. It was not a fairy tale. It was a work schedule, with unpaid emotional labor tucked into the corners like a lost sweater. There were late nights when I made calls that received curt returns, and mornings when I answered to the press office that wanted nothing and everything. And there were moments of gentle surprise. Catherine bringing me soup when the flu hit the office, offering to let me take a half day when my mother needed me to come home. Small things that stacked against the myth until, more often than not, I found myself looking forward to those quiet exchanges. We were careful with each other. She never crossed without asking. I never crossed without wanting to. Our flirtation was a slow thing, the way certain light creeps along a wall and eventually softens it. Once, when she forgot her tablet at a boardroom, she looked at me and said, almost plaintively, "Do you think my ex-wife would have retrieved it for me?" There were jokes with an edge. She was 43, and I was 24. She'd spent a life negotiating others' expectations, and I'd spent mine setting tables so people could forget the seams in their garments. Power lived between us like an animal both of us had to feed or starve. We fed it with honesty. We starved it with rules. The first touch happened in the pantry, because of course it did. I was reaching for almond milk when she brushed against my shoulder. There was no theatrics, no scripted seduction. Her hand hovered there for a second, then pressed, as if to make sure I was steady. I felt a pulse in my neck and leaned into the warmth of assurance of that hand. We both laughed afterward, like we had been caught doing something ordinary that suddenly felt precious. I was not naive. I understood risk. I saw the headlines when wealthy people dated people with less to gain. I knew the cautionary tales, trophies with ankles that turned on the same nights. But there was a kindness to the way she asked, and an insistence on my voice. "If you ever want me to stop," she said one night from across the desk, "you say stop, and I'll step back. No questions." I tested that boundary, more for myself than for her, by saying, "Not tonight," when she asked me to join her at an after-hours event. She smiled and didn't press. Agency was one of the curious luxuries she offered without fanfare. That made me want to be careful with it. The city outside moved like someone who never tired of rehearsal. I learned her tastes, her coffee black and precise, the way she liked the ice in her glass barely stirred. She liked old records, not the streamed playlists of the rest of the office. In turn, I brought her small things from my Brooklyn life, my mother's empanadas on a day she had to miss lunch, my ability to translate subway delays into pragmatic arrival times. These exchange points softened the edges between our worlds. We were not merging, we were negotiating. Then Rachel came. She arrived like a chapter break with lipstick the color of danger. Red hair, sharper cheekbones, and a smile that was practiced enough to be weaponized. People said she'd been Michael Sterling's, Catherine's late husband's, lawyer at the firm, then something more complicated after that. She moved through rooms like a person who had already written the script in her head. Her entrance to the Sterling office was not dramatic at first. She signed in like everyone else. She sent the receptionist a smile that made the flowers in the lobby seem shy. But there was heat in the way she looked at Catherine, an old map of intimacy layered with accusation. Catherine's face cooled like a chess player who'd seen a risky move and decided to counter. Rachel's presence made other people slow down. A company built on curated appearances suddenly felt exposed. Rachel didn't come in quietly. She began with questions that looked like concern and landed like knives. She asked about events, about certain lined journal entries I had not yet known were in play, about Michael's death in a way that felt like she was testing whether others remembered the right memory. She spoke in terms that made the air bitter in my mouth. Her insinuations were careful, patient arrows aimed to unsettle. One afternoon, she cornered me in the lobby under the institutional light and said conversationally, "You work for Catherine, right? She's been through so much. It must be strange to be so close to someone with that kind of history." I didn't know how to answer without sounding like someone who'd been hired for her appearance. "I'm her assistant," I said. "I do scheduling and admin. I don't judge her." Rachel smiled like she'd heard the right thing. "Of course. I just worry about public perception. People remember scandal." Her tone carried subtext. I felt suddenly like an insect on a leaf. I had always been a quick study, but in the face of Rachel's insinuations, I felt less sure of the parts of myself that had been certain. Catherine closed the office door to us both, and for the first time, I saw Catherine's armor crack. Catherine had nights where she was made of porcelain. I learned to recognize the cracks. She kept pill bottles in a top drawer, folded letters that smelled faintly of old copper and cigarette smoke, and a pattern of withdrawal that made her tired in the mornings. Once, I came into her office to find her on the couch, sleeves rolled up, a bottle of water still warm from a microwave that didn't usually exist in those rooms. She apologized in a way that made grief look like homework she hadn't completed. "You can tell me if this is too much," she said, rubbing the back of her hand as if smoothing a crease in a dress. "If I ask too little or too much." "You don't ask too little," I said. "You ask exactly what you need." There were nights she cried in a voice that was not made for privacy. She had journals, lined, old, and smelling like the leather of briefcases, that she hid beneath a false bottom in her safe. I only discovered them later. For now, I collected small signals like coins. The way she avoided certain roads, the way she tensed when a name was spoken, the way she flinched when someone mentioned Michael as if the sound might break her. People make stories out of facts they don't own, she told me once, when I came in to find an angry email from Rachel printed and placed on the corner of her desk. They tie knots where there are none. I don't want to be a story, I said. You won't be, she said. Not with me. But Rachel wanted everything to be a story. She started to feed the rumor mills in the way predators do. Slowly, with insinuations that left a stain. She spoke in tough girl prose to the financial press, told them of mismanagement, of strange loyalties. She started to show up at events with a camera-friendly smile and a whisper of conspiracy. People who had always called Catherine stoic began to ask questions. People who had always nodded in meetings started to look sideways. The first real collision came with a letter. An envelope that tumbled onto my desk one morning like a live thing. Inside was a photocopied receipt for a locksmith, a courier's signature blurred to anonymity, and a single line of handwriting I recognized from wedding invitations and condolence notes. It was Rachel's hand, which had once written affection and now wrote accusation. She claimed she'd found evidence of misappropriated funds. She claimed Catherine had interfered in investigating Michael's death because of an affair, because of jealousy, because of anything that would make the public understand her, instead of pity her. When you work in service, you learn to keep to the present tense. But then there are moments where history presses and asks you to choose a side. My choices were not heroic. They were practical. I could leave and return to nights that smelled of grease and fluorescent lights. I could stay and watch a woman who had given me a chance be dismantled in the name of gossip. I called my mother and spoke in short sentences. You can always come home, she said. I signed, I told her. You said it yourself. You told me to go. She listened to silence on the other end like an old radio trying to pick up a station. Be careful, she said, and come to Sunday dinner. I baked her a pie the Sunday before everything changed. I needed to feel normal. I wanted to taste sugar and butter and know that some things were right. Catherine texted me a photograph of a healing plant on her balcony with the caption, "Your pie was a weapon." She sent a smiley I'd learned to read as affection. Then the afternoon the raid happened. The world tilted. I was in a filing room cataloging donor letters when someone in the hallway said the word FBI, and time cracked. It was not cinematic. There were no shouting men in trench coats breaking down doors. It was clinical. A team arrived with warrants, careful in their hands, systematic in their search. Cameras appeared at the periphery, like a constellation forming. People were asked to step into small conference rooms under the pretense of interviews. Catherine was led away by agents who talked to her like she was a person whose life they could order. They took phones and notebooks. The office felt like a house with the lights cut out. Everyone waiting for someone to flip a switch that would bring the world back. Rachel watched with something like triumph, and I felt my stomach hollow out at the sight. She held her head high, a public face that did not tell what she'd said to whom. Catherine didn't scream. She looked at me when the agents walked her past my desk. For a moment, there was a private conversation that passed between us without sound. She mouthed sorry, and I thought of all the things that had slipped between her fingers like sand. The safe, the pills, the notebook she told me was nothing. She was, for a fraction of a second, a woman who did not know how to make the room stop. After they left with her, William Reed, tall, perfumed, chairman by title and by temperament, called a meeting. The board issued a preliminary statement about cooperating with authorities and placed Catherine on administrative leave pending investigation. They said the company would act in the best interest of stakeholders. They used words that sounded like insurance. I went home that night and packed up the small belongings that fit into my tote. The press had already circled like gulls, waiting for scraps of scandal. My mother watched the television with a face that had learned to know private grief as public spectacle. People like to see a head roll, she said. I had the contract, Clause 7, folded between pages of a notebook. I could have removed its teeth and burned them. Instead, I kept it in my bag as if the paper itself might anchor truth to me. I had signed it because I wanted stability. I had also signed it because I wanted someone to trust me. Now the same paper felt like evidence. They reassigned me the next morning. Gregory, a temporary supervisor with a clipboard face and a voice that tried to make everything administratively sound, told me I would be relocated to a team handling background files while the inquiry ran its course. It was a polite way of saying, keep her out of sight. Isolation is a peculiar and public thing. When you are removed from the orbit of someone you care for, your mind does what an old radio does when a station falls out of range. It hunts for the signal. I spent days looking at photographs I'd taken on my phone. Catherine at the Met, Catherine laughing over a private joke, her profile lit like sculpture in winter light. I replayed conversations I'd had with her, listening for the shiver of truth beneath the words. Did I help her? Had I enabled something? Or had I simply let my own needs be part of the calculus? I called a lawyer because the law feels like an ocean, and I had no boat. Patricia Sterling's attorney, Catherine's attorney, was precise, the kind of woman who did not underplay and did not overshare. She walked through the protections the company could offer, the confidentiality agreements, the limits of what I could say. She spoke gently about loyalty and obligation, of how a young assistant could be swept under tide and washed up somewhere they did not ask to be. Document everything, she said. Every email, every meeting, every time you were asked to do something outside the realm of your duties. If they try to use you as leverage, you need to be prepared. I listened and, like a person at the bottom of a well, wrote everything down. In the quiet of my apartment, with the city humming like an engine below, I started to keep a ledger of moments. The night at the gala, the contract, the pantry touch, the pill bottle in the drawer, Rachel's insinuations. I wrote with the rawness of someone who had been given a new language. It felt like constructing a raft with scraps. And then the text started. Anonymous numbers, screenshots of old photos, fragments of overheard conversations stitched into accusations, delivered like mosquitoes. Someone wanted to make this public, to make it hurt. The public has a reflexive appetite for drama, and someone was feeding it. One night, back in the small light of my kitchen, my phone vibrated with a new message. The number was masked. The words were plain. We need to talk. Midnight. The Met. Bring nothing. My first instinct was to toss the phone in the sink and pretend the whole thing had not happened. My second, braver instinct, curious and dangerous, was to go. If there was someone trying to manipulate the narrative, I wanted to see who pulled the strings. If there was evidence, I wanted to find it. If Catherine needed me and could not say so, I wanted to be there. I told myself I could leave any time. I told myself this was investigation, not romance. But I also told myself that I was not the same woman who carried trays and watched people forget the names of the servers. I had signed a paper because I thought I was making a good decision for my mother and for myself. Now a masked text dared me to act. I buttoned my coat like armor and took the subway uptown. The Met at midnight looked different. 12 floors of art and history sleeping under velvet light. I waited by the Egyptian wing, where the cool air smelled faintly of stone and wax. The city felt like a secret peeled back to reveal its bones. A figure moved through the shadows and stopped before me. It was Catherine, backlit and more fragile than the woman who signed her name on checks and balance sheets. She held an envelope and her hands were steady, but small in my gaze. The light from the museum made her hair look like shadowed copper. I didn't tell you to come, she said, in the kind of whisper people use when confessing sins to someone they trust to heal them. I got a text, I said. So did everyone, I imagine. She gave a humorless little smile and handed me the envelope. Inside were photocopies, letters, and one page in particular that was the kind of neat handwriting you keep for evidence. It was a letter that implicated someone I had only met in the margins of boardroom photos. It was a paper that made my world tilt, the kind of tilt that makes you question every motive you've been given. "I can't go into details here," she said. "But if you take this to the board and say you saw these, they'll listen." This was the hinge. She offered me a role I hadn't auditioned for: witness, ally, possible exile. Her eyes found mine, and for the first time since I'd signed the contract, there was no manager and employee dynamic. There was only two women standing in a museum that had seen 1,000 secrets and deciding what to do with one more. "We could ruin people," I said, "because truth is heavier than rumor, and ruin is a possible consequence of revelation." "We could also be the ones to tell what really happened," she replied. "You signed for stability, Lily. This isn't about the money you got. This is about the truth I didn't have the courage to bring forward." Her voice cracked, and I felt something in my chest like a door opening. There is a difference between being complicit and being cautious. There is also a difference between being afraid and being paralyzed. I had been thinking about my mother, about the stipend, about the job, and what it meant to come home with something in my pocket. I had not been thinking about what it meant to be part of making someone whole again. "You know there's a risk," I said. "I know," she said. "But you also know me. You know I'm not asking you to be a puppet." I held the papers like a stone. They were the weight of possibility. I could hand them to the board and watch careers crumble. I could keep them hidden and watch a woman disintegrate quietly. I could do nothing and go back to the life that fit my hands like a glove. "What will it cost you?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. She touched my hand, a brief thing. And with it, she made an unspoken promise to be careful, to protect as much as she could, to let me choose every step. She had the power to offer me wealth and protection, and she was asking me to use it as leverage for truth. I decided to act the way I always had, by making a list and checking it twice. I gathered the copies, tucked them into my bag, and walked back into the night, the city a smear of halos and traffic and indifferent neon. There was a kind of vertigo in wielding power that used to exist only in other people's hands. When I returned to my apartment, the building was quiet. My mother had washed the dishes and left a note on the table. "Don't do anything stupid," signed with a heart. Her practicality was a prayer. I looked at the papers and knew they would not make the choice for me. They would ask me to be willing. The next morning, I was reassigned officially. A memo said I would be placed on temporary duty with corporate administration. They told me it was for my own protection. They used the words sensitivity and confidentiality, which are the terms the powerful use to tidy away anything messy. I packed my things slowly. In the drawer where I kept personal items, there was a folded scrap of paper where Catherine had once written a number she said she liked because it was the year her mother married. It was silly and intimate and completely out of place in the clinical feeling of corporate reassignments. On my way out, I touched it like someone blessing the past. And then, in the cold fluorescent light of a temporary cubicle, I received a call that would change the course of everything. A voice I knew, Catherine's attorney, said, quietly but with steel, that the FBI had executed a warrant at the Sterling penthouse. She asked me where the safe was. My heart did a curious flip. I had known the safe existed, a place where a woman kept things that were either too dangerous or too dear to display. I listened to her speak with a lawyer's clarity while my hands trembled. "We need to create a record," she said. "We need to ensure that nothing is altered. You need to write everything down." I obeyed because I had promised myself I would. I sat there in a room that smelled faintly of plastic and paper and started to write down the list of things that mattered. The contract, the journals, the pill bottles, the night at the gala, Rachel's presence, Catherine's tears, the envelope she'd given me at the Met. I wrote with the intensity of someone building a bridge out of personal memory. This is where I stop for now. Because a life can pivot on paperwork, on the decision to share a truth, on the way one woman reaches across a gulf and pulls another closer. There was a knock on the conference room door as I wrote, Outside, voices were calm but firm, the kind of voices that carry legal weight. I folded my list, slid it into my bag, and waited to see what the next page would say. The knock on the conference room door felt like punctuation I hadn't invited. I folded my list, slid it into my bag, and walked toward the sound like a person moving toward an exam that would judge everything she'd lived. The agents who entered were careful, efficient, and annoyingly human in the way they lowered their voices like people apologizing for having to be correct. They asked me where the safe was, where Catherine kept the journals, whether I knew of anyone who had motive to tamper with documents. I answered as I had been taught to answer, honestly, measured, with the ledger of dates and small facts that made big things tolerable. They asked me if I had the contract. When I said yes, they asked to see it. I handed it over. The page that had haunted me, the underlined Clause 7, was photographed, catalogued, and folded into an evidence packet. It felt obscene, and also oddly consoling to watch the words I had signed be turned into an object of process. Someone called it chain of custody. To me, it felt like a map of choices. After the agents left with their boxes and soft-footed certainty, the office hum was not the same. People moved around like they were walking over a floor that had been freshly waxed and would scuff easily. Rachel's face brightened in the press. She gave interviews in which she framed herself as a concerned colleague, a guardian of corporate integrity. She said the right things to television cameras, words like accountability and due process, with the ease of someone accustomed to being filmed. I watched it all from a cube that had been assigned to me under the language of protection. Gregory, who had the unenviable job of being the repository of administrative normalcy, gave me a playlist of gentle music to keep me from replaying things aloud. I pretended not to notice the way my coworkers' gazes flicked away from my name badge that still bore Sterling Enterprises. Being shielded meant being watched. Patricia called me in the second week and said 3 simple things: document, corroborate, and be ready. She said them like a liturgy. She said she would call Maria Chen, a former assistant who had left the company quietly the year before and who, Patricia said without commentary, might remember certain conversations that had been privately awkward. She also said something practical and blunt. If the board is unwilling to act, we will make them listen. I remembered Maria from a holiday luncheon, a woman with a laugh that always began at the back of her throat, and a habit of rearranging the sugar packets on the dessert tray until they looked like ceremonial lines. I had only a faint idea why she'd left, and I had not expected to hear her name in the same sentence as evidence. Patricia arranged a meeting for a diner near the Hudson, a place where the coffee was strong, and no one pretended the booths weren't small. Maria arrived with a careful gait and a folder that looked like every folder I'd ever seen in a legal drama. She ordered an iced coffee, and then looked at me like someone hearing a cherished record. She said she'd tried to speak up before. When Michael had gotten sick, she said the words like they were badly made tea. People had been told to let the family manage. She'd heard conversations about off-the-books payments and things being smoothed. She'd noticed Rachel's habit of handling details with a firmness that bordered on ownership. It wasn't obvious then, Maria said. These things aren't obvious until you know what to look for. But there were phone calls scheduled at odd hours. There were courier slips slipped into folders with no explanation. And there was a fear in the room that people mistook for respect. She handed me an affidavit that she had written, precise and careful. In it, she described an incident where Rachel had called her into a conference room and leaned in close to ask if anyone would make something disappear. She used a phrase I would come to hear again. Manage narratives. And it landed like wet plaster. The thought of someone constructing a narrative and then arranging bodies to fit into it made my skin crawl. Patricia arranged everything in the way a conductor arranges tempo. She asked Maria to file the affidavit with legal counsel. She scheduled a private board briefing, and she asked me to bring the photocopies from the Met meeting. There was also a practical human question. Did I want to testify? The word made me think of glass, and how easily it can be broken into shards that will cut both the intended target and the hands that hold them. I decided to testify because there was no moral triangle available to me anymore. It had collapsed into a single line. I would do it for the woman who had given me an honest job, for my mother who needed a roof, and quietly, for myself. I had not expected to become the kind of person who would stand in a room and tell the truth in a way that mattered. But choices have a way of teaching you what you are made of. The day of the board briefing was bright, in the way late winter days can be bright, the light crisp and somehow accusing. The boardroom had a table that could seat 12, and a view that looked over those same toy cars I had learned to notice. They were there. William Reed in a jacket that cost more than my rent. Patricia with a compact notepad and a face that held no surprises. 2 other board members who had minimal expressions, and a line of legal counsel who radiated client control. When my name was called, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I walked in with a bag that held the photographs and copies we'd discussed. Maria's affidavit folded in a folder that smelled like printer ink. I gave my account the way someone reads inventory. Concise, measured, the facts arranged so they could not be dislodged. I described nights and scraps, Catherine handing me a notebook, a pill bottle in a top drawer, Rachel's phone calls in the early hours. I told them about the Met envelope and handed it across the table. The letter, Rachel's handwriting, was read aloud by Patricia because the board liked to hear things in the voice of those who could command consequence. It said what it had always implied. Someone had tried to organize a narrative in a way that pointed blame away from a certain set of actors and toward another. It named a courier. It described meetings that had happened in the business of grief. It was careful and precise, the kind of thing made by a person who believed she could write people into patterns. There was a moment where the room narrowed, and I thought the glass in the windows would crack. William Reed's jaw worked like a machine. One of the board members, older, with a pause between words that meant she'd been in crisis committees before, asked Rachel to explain. Rachel answered with a practiced indignation. Her voice did not shake. She accused us of fabricating things, of a coordinated attempt to protect a privileged executive. She pointed at Catherine's name as if it were a wound that everyone wanted to examine, and made a show of pulling her own sleeves up in the light. But Maria stood up in a way that stayed with me. She told them about the late calls, the courier slips, the odd payments she'd been asked to reconcile. She was calm and precise in a manner that made the board stop pretending neutrality was an adequate response. Her affidavit and her face created a turning point. When someone finally said, "We will put this to a vote," the air in the room felt like an organ breath. The vote was not dramatic in the way movies show votes. It was a roll of eyes and an amendment, a conference call and an exchange with legal. But the result was clear enough. The board decided to begin an internal review of Rachel's conduct and to move forward with removing her from any position of influence pending that review. They also voted to lift, temporarily, some of the public restrictions on Catherine's administrative standing while the investigation proceeded. It was not a courtroom, and it was not a definitive exoneration, but it was a pivot in the narrative. For the first time in weeks, the press cycle stuttered. We won in the way people win when someone finally looks at an inconvenient truth and says, "This should be different." But victory tasted strange. It tasted like coffee that had been left to cool. The headlines the next day were generous and then suspicious, 2 appetites wrestling. Rachel ran op-eds that recast herself as the defender of shareholder value. There were sympathetic profiles of Catherine in magazines that loved a damaged heiress. The public likes its pain tidy and its heroes clean. Then, the text about the accident arrived. It was a message that arrived on a sunny afternoon when we had just finished a meeting about donor commitments for the foundation the company was trying to spin into a softer story. Catherine was present in the room by video, appearing on the screen like a woman in a painting, her voice thin but steady. I was taking notes at the table when my phone lit with a new message from a number I did not recognize. The 3 words inside were enough to make the air go cold. Angela Moretti. Settlement 2018. My stomach dropped in a familiar, lurching way. Angela, her name tugged at something in the back of my mind, was the woman from the accident 6 years earlier. The one who'd been hurt when a car swerved outside a fundraiser and never fully recovered. I had heard the rumor in the margins. There had been talk of compensation and hush money. Catherine had never mentioned it to me. The thought of a payment buried without public disclosure made my throat ache. Patricia asked if I wanted to step out. I stayed because avoidance felt like complicity, and because Catherine, on the screen, had that look of someone being watched. She had the same eyes she'd used the night we'd stood by the museum. A look I had learned to read as an invitation to trust her, or a challenge to test her. I asked her about Angela in a way that was not a question, but a door. She told me the story in a voice that sounded older than her years. Michael's driving that night had been reckless, she said, and the accident was an outcome of a life they'd both lived with risk and too many glass bottles. The settlement, she said, had been meant to cover Angela's medical care and privacy, while the family grieved without having their wounds paraded. She'd paid privately and asked for discretion, because Angela had wanted to avoid attention. She had never meant for it to be a secret that could later be turned into a weapon against her. I felt my face show the heat of judgment I didn't want to feel. "Why didn't you tell the board?" I asked. "Why didn't you let anyone know about this?" "Because I was trying to protect people who were hurt," she said. "Because sometimes when you yell, more people get hurt. I thought I could fix the edges without making the center explode." Her answer was measured and human in a way that made me understand the difference between secrecy, born of shame, and secrecy, born of protection. But it did not erase the fact that the omission looked like something else to the public eye, concealment that could be framed as guilt. That evening, a reporter called our office and asked pointedly whether Catherine had disclosed material liabilities. The press smelled blood in the water and circled, but Patricia moved carefully. She said the company would cooperate, that details that involved private settlements would be addressed with respect to the people involved. It was, again, a way of speaking that acknowledged complexity without turning it into chatter. Still, the text about Angela had the power to change everything. Rachel seized on it like a person who had an arrow in a quiver. She's a good operator, I thought. She collects moments that can be weaponized, she strings them together, and then she throws them into the narrative current with a label that says, "Look." The legal world is full of ways to make truth look like a fault line. We were walking on one. I called Angela, because I needed to know the human shape behind the controversy. Patricia provided a number with the delicacy of someone handling a fragile vase. When I spoke to her, she answered after 2 rings with a voice threaded through hospital visits and physical therapy. She sounded tired in the way that physical pain writes endurance into language. When I asked if she would be willing to meet, she paused and asked me whom I represented. I told her I was Catherine's assistant and that I was calling because I wanted to listen. She laughed, a short, surprised sound, and asked what an assistant could possibly do. I told her she could be a person who didn't show up to the story with a headline in hand. She agreed to meet. We met at a cafe that looked like a place that had not been scrubbed of humanity for publicity photos. She wore a scarf that hid a limp and a smile that did not need to be made. Angela told me quietly about pain and the small bureaucracies of healing. Money had paid for a therapist who was good, for a ramp in a house that had stairs like a memory, for medication and transportation. She said she had asked for privacy because her mother could not handle the publicity, and because sometimes attention feels like a second injury. "I don't want to ruin anyone's life," Angela said. "I wanted to get better." "What do you want now?" I asked, perhaps put more bluntly than she expected. People rarely ask survivors what they want without a motive. "I want it to be right," she said. "I want the person who hurt me to take responsibility in a way that helps other people, not just fix my rent." When she said that, a new path opened. This was no longer only about PR. This was about reparative action. It was about turning a private payment into a public promise. Catherine came to the idea too, not as a CEO looking for spin, but as a woman who had been living inside regret for so long it had become a kind of currency. She wrote a speech in the early morning that was heavy with admission and apology. She said she had protected Angela's privacy, but had been clumsy in not letting others know. She offered in that speech to the company and later to the public to step down so she could focus on reparative work, on a foundation that would fund survivors' medical care and legal support. It was a choice that looked radical, because she was wealthy enough to stay in place and clean the narrative without changing the pattern. "I want to do work that matters," she said to me one afternoon when the cameras were turned off and the office smelled like exhausted coffee. "I want to make the kind of amends that doesn't get simplified into a headline." "You don't have to resign to do that," I said, because the practical part of me clung to positions and titles like lifelines. "You can create the foundation and stay." She looked at me with eyes that had spent years measuring consequence. "I don't want the foundation to be attached to a name that people see as a liability," she replied. "If I step aside, the work won't be filtered by gossip. And I want someone to run it who understands what it means to be given a second chance." It took me a second to understand the shape of what she was offering. She wanted to step down as CEO and make reparations meaningful. She wanted to redirect her wealth into work that tangibly helped people like Angela. And she wanted me, someone who had been close enough to witness both tenderness and misstep, to be at her side, not as an assistant, but as a collaborator. The offer felt impossible and terrifying in equal measure. An assistant's life is contained. Tasks, schedules, the small certainties of coffee and calendar invites. Partnership is a different architecture of responsibility. It asked for a capacity I was only beginning to discover. I thought of my mother's sagging roof, and the way stability sounded like a song I could finally learn. But I also thought of everything the contract had implied, and the way public trust had to be earned, not purchased. "I don't want to be a figurehead," I said. "I want to do something that lasts." She smiled in that way that was more private than public. "Partnership," she said. "Write it in your own hand. Don't let my lawyers sanitize it." We worked through the logistics with the kind of slow tenderness two people who are learning to trust each other cultivate. We consulted Patricia and a panel of advisors, and we drafted a structure for the Sterling Foundation for Survivors that placed survivors in governance roles and directed funding to medical care and legal advocacy. It was deliberately structured to avoid the traps of paternalism. We wanted to build something that would help without polling people's lives like a map. When Catherine announced her decision to step down, the press described it as a surrender or a noble escape, depending on who wrote the piece. I sat beside her at a luncheon after the announcement, and she squeezed my hand under the table like a woman rehearsing a new kind of muscle. She retired to a quieter life publicly, and we began the work of building something that would make the word trust mean more than a marketing line. There were legal threads that pulled and tugged at us. Rachel's conduct was reviewed. She was accused of witness tampering and of perpetuating a narrative that had real victims. She hired counsel, so did we. The legal endgame was messy and procedural. Plea offers, pending charges, negotiated statements. I won't pretend there were definitive court scenes with dramatic exonerations. Real life is more patient and less clean than that. Rachel faced consequences that changed her professional standing. Some charges were dropped, some were pursued. The work of justice is not always satisfaction. It is often a slow groove turning toward something more equitable. The board voted to accept Catherine's resignation with gratitude, and to their credit, asked her to remain as a trustee for the foundation to ensure continuity. She accepted on the condition that the foundation would have independent governance, and that survivors would not be tokenized. Patricia and I worked on bylaws and selection committees, and we recruited Angela to a position on the advisory board because she had asked to be part of building the solution that might have helped her in a more public way. The day Angela visited the Sterling offices to sign her advisory board paperwork, she walked slowly, with a gait that had remembered pain, and still carried a dignity that surprised a lot of people who think of survivors as merely wounded. She had a quiet magnetism about her, an ability to listen like someone who has learned the cost of being spoken over. Catherine and Angela sat across from each other in a small conference room with ivy painted on the wall and the sun looking in with an odd tenderness. They talked for a long time. I sat in the chair beside them, my hands folded in my lap like ballast. Angela told Catherine about small humiliations that had accrued in the wake of the accident. The stares on the subway, the well-meaning gossip that carried pity rather than help. Catherine listened and then apologized with a precision that was not theatrical. She admitted that she had been trying to protect Angela, but that in doing so, she had also removed agency from the person she intended to protect. Angela said she understood, but wanted the record to show that privacy could not take the place of public responsibility. "We'll do more than give money," Angela said, her voice carrying a steadiness that made everyone in the room listen, like they were in church and she was speaking scripture. "We'll help people navigate systems that make them small, not heal them as whole people." That became our guiding principle. Do not substitute money for dignity. The foundation would fund medical care and legal support, yes, but it would also fund community centers, transport, and advocacy groups that taught survivors how to navigate bureaucracy. We insisted on lived experience leadership. We built grant criteria written in plain language because people with pain do not need more paperwork. As the foundation took shape, Catherine and I devoted ourselves to the work in ways that reconfigured our personal relationship. We had started as employer and employee, then been something tender and complicated, while the world tried to read us like a headline. Now we stood side by side as co-directors in a project that would be visible and accountable. Our intimacy did not disappear. It transformed into a thing that was interwoven with purpose. We were careful at first. A public relationship between a wealthy donor and a former assistant could easily be framed as transactional. We insisted on transparency and on mutual agency. Catherine had the resources to make an impact. I had the life experience of someone who knew what it meant to be given a second chance and to be expected to use it with humility. The rewritten Clause 7, if you could even call it that in our new structure, was drafted in my handwriting on a napkin over late-night takeout the night before the Foundation's public launch. It read, in a small, messy script, "We promise to listen. Consent is ongoing. Power will be shared. We promise that no relationship at the Foundation would be predicated on dependency." We chose to show it rather than let it live in legalese. It wasn't a contract. It was a covenant. The Foundation launched on a clear day with a modest event and people who had been touched by the story present in the room. Journalists asked the hard questions we'd anticipated. We answered with transparency. We did not claim heroism. We claimed responsibility and a structure meant to minimize harm and maximize support. For once, a narrative felt like an action. There were small victories and their complicating shadows. Rachel's public reputation dimmed. Some of her supporters called it a witch hunt, others a necessary correction. The company moved forward with new policies around employee vulnerability and the handling of sensitive settlements. People outside the circle would still gossip. That is the way the public ecosystem functions. But inside our work, there was a new rhythm. Between meetings and press calls and drafts of grant agreements, Catherine and I found moments of private tenderness that were more ordinary and therefore more radical than any spectacle. She learned to fold laundry as if it were a diplomatic act. I taught her because it felt like a way to be intimate without words. She brought me soup when I was sick. I brought her empanadas on days she had back-to-back donor meetings. We cooked slowly in her kitchen, a small thing that felt like rebellion given the way our lives had been public for months. Consent in our physical relationship was something we kept naming. It was not because we were trying to be perfect. It was because the moment we had begun to cross that line as employer and employee had required a kind of ethical scaffolding we wanted to keep intact. We built rituals of check-ins, small, ordinary questions like, "Do you want company tonight?" And we kept them like a sort of prayer. Once, in the quiet of a Sunday afternoon, we sat in her small living room and rewrote Clause 7 together on a sheet of stationery. We burned the original page ceremonially, not because burning paper is dramatic, but because the physical act of letting it go felt necessary. We wrote instead, "There is no clause for love. There is practice, consent, respect, and shared risk." We signed our names, no titles beneath it. It felt both simple and like a manifesto. A year later, the anniversary of the night I had signed the original contract arrived like a personal holiday. The city had moved through seasons and 1,000 other stories. The foundation had grown and become a modest but respected presence in the city's philanthropic conversation. Catherine had stepped down from day-to-day corporate leadership and now guided the foundation with a hands-on humility that made donors stop and listen. Rachel had largely retreated from public life, a cautionary tale about power and narrative. Angela's recovery had been ongoing, messy and human. She had become one of the foundation's leading voices for survivor-centered policy, and she and I had an easy camaraderie that sometimes made Catherine laugh with relief. The three of us, Catherine, Angela, and I, had learned to sit at the same table without roles that made any of us small. On that anniversary, Catherine set the old lacquered desk back where it had been in the penthouse years ago. It was a small ritual to place things differently, a way to mark that the room no longer needed to hold secrets. She asked me to sit where I had sat the night I first considered the contract. The city glittered below, Manhattan a map of decisions. She took my hands in hers, familiar, warm, and produced the scrap of stationery where we had rewritten Clause 7. In a quiet voice, she read the line we had chosen as a covenant. Then she slid a small folded note across the desk. This was not legal. It was a letter, handwritten in a careful female script that was intimate without being private. It said simply, "I sign this as my vow to build with you, not by you." The letter was a promise that we would hold each other's agency like something precious and fragile. I let the city hold its breath as I took the paper and wrote my initials on the corner, small and deliberate. The act was less about making a sound public than about making something binding between us that had no legal teeth but infinite moral force. We did not pretend the past had been erased. There were still court dates where testimony happened, and Rachel's appeals lingered like unfinished music. The foundation had to navigate skeptical donors and bureaucratic hurdles, but the day-to-day had shifted toward ordinary contentment, which is not the same as happiness, but rather a steady weather you can survive in. I visited my mother more often, brought fresh empanadas, fixed a leaky faucet. She joked that her daughter had become important enough to have a proper pantry in the penthouse. Our home life became its own work. Some days we were a team coordinating donor outreach. Other days we were two women arguing about which plant needed more light. We learned to be candid in small ways. I told her when I felt out of place, and she apologized when she let power accidentally leak into private moments. We both learned to say, "I'm sorry," in ways that were specific and practical. Apologies became plans. "I'm sorry. I will check my language." "I'm sorry. Let me call you first next time I have a press request." There were tender nights, more than I could count, that built like slow braids. The smell of her cologne, the hush of rain on the window. Once, when a donor was particularly difficult and our meeting had been a performance of patience, we fell into bed and spoke in a language that was more gentle than sex. It was the slow inventory of the day, the exchange of little victories. We made sense of our activism with the only thing that ever made sense: presence. On a quiet afternoon, we visited Angela's community center, which the foundation helped fund. It was a refurbished storefront with chairs in a circle and pamphlets printed in plain language. Children's drawings lined the wall. Angela greeted us with a warmth that no camera could manufacture. We sat in a circle and listened to people talk about navigating medical bills, about returning to work, about how small kindnesses could make systems less brutal. I watched Catherine, who had once been an ice widow in the gossip columns, sit and listen with a humility I had not known she contained. She asked questions that revealed she had been learning to make accountability mean more than public gestures. She asked about what repairs looked like in the long term, and wrote notes that were unreadable to others, but seemed reverent to her. I felt protective and proud in ways that were entirely new. 1 year on from the night of the gala, 1 year after the contract that had changed my life, my city, and my choices, Catherine and I sat at the desk and closed a ledger of the foundation's first year's grants. It was not everything I wanted the foundation to be yet, but it had funded direct assistance for dozens of people and created a legal clinic that did pro bono work. We had used wealth to make room for others to reclaim their agency. The work made sense. That night, we did not make a show of it. We cooked empanadas, which is to say I cooked, and she boxed flour like she had learned the weight of things the way she had learned to hold my hand. Carefully. We ate on the small balcony overlooking the city where, months earlier, I had felt like I had made the right or wrong decision with the press of her hand on my hip. The skyline glittered the exact same way it had then, but now seemed inhabited by a different kind of meaning. I pulled a folded scrap of paper from the inside pocket of my coat. The original Clause 7, black ink underlined. We had not destroyed it. We had kept it like a fossil. Catherine watched as I unfolded it, and then, with a small laugh that was more like a release, she produced a pen and wrote across the margin, in my handwriting and hers, "This does not define us." She then slid across the desk the napkin where we had written our covenant. Underneath, in ink that looked almost illegible from being folded and unfolded so many times, we each signed with our full names. There was no legalese, no compensation schedule, only a promise written in hand to remember that love is not a clause. I felt something in my chest that was like the loosening of a knot. Later, long after the dishes had been cleared, and the city had cycled into the low, humbling dark, Catherine took my hand and traced a line up my wrist like a cartographer. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if we would have met without all of this?" "All of it?" I asked. "All of it," she repeated. "The gala, the contract, the mess." I thought of the night my life had tipped, the spill of champagne like a comet, and of the ledger I had kept like a small raft. "Maybe we would have found each other in other ways," I said, honestly. "But do you know what I'd have missed? The way you let me see the seam, the way we had to build a bridge." She smiled, that smaller, softer smile I had loved since day one. "Then we keep building," she said. Together. The city below carried on as cities do. Headlines came and went. New scandals rose like tide. Our work remained stubbornly present, a hum underneath the noise. If you had asked me on that night at the penthouse whether I believed a contract could become a covenant, I might have laughed. Now, a year later, I could see the arc of something that had been built out of hard choices. An assistant who learned to testify and stand, a billionaire who chose to step down and repair, a survivor who reclaimed dignity, and a small foundation that refused to hide behind generosity as a cover for absence. I signed the billionaire's contract that night, and it changed what I felt for her forever. It did not buy my affection. It forced the honesty that made affection possible. It taught me that agency is not only about the ability to say yes or no, but also about the courage to change the terms when they stop serving the common good. It taught me that love is not a clause, never was and never should be, but it can grow into a practice that honors consent, work, and repair. If you're watching this and you feel moved by a story where power is questioned and rebuilt, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear how stories like this live in your city. And if you want to follow along for more stories that mix tenderness with messy realities, subscribe and stay with us. We're building, slowly and imperfectly, toward something better.